Hi, my name is Petonia, and my presentation is the exploration on the works of Jackson Pollock. Just to talk a little bit about his early life and education, Jackson Pollock was born in 1912 in Cody, Wyoming, and he was the youngest of five boys. He did move around quite a bit, growing up in Arizona and Chico, California. While he was in California, he was enrolled at the Manual Arts High School, where he was eventually expelled. But while he was there, he studied under the influence of Frederick John de Saint Vrain. How do you pronounce it? Schwankovsky. Yeah. Schwankovsky was a painter and an illustrator that gave him basically like the most like basic training he had in drawing and painting, and he was also a member of the Theosophical Society. For those who don't know, the Theosophical Society was a sector in the school that promoted basically occult spirituality and metaphysics. While he was studying underneath him, he also introduced him to artists in like European modern art, just like the advanced theories. Just and as far as like who Schwankovsky was, he had a lot of on top of like the rudimentary training, he did have a lot of influence in Pollock's life as far as like religion or just like his belief systems and how that played a role in how he was able to produce a lot of his art in his adult years. Pollock was raised by an agnostic family, and agnosticism is basically the belief that the existence of God is pretty much unknown or unachievable to the human mind. So while he was at school, Schwab, Schwankovsky encouraged a lot of theosophical literature, which is the idea that the knowledge of God can be achieved through spiritual ecstasy or intuition. So it was the first time he was introduced to the idea of the human body or the human mind being achieved, being like combined into the idea of God, so that this is like an achievable state or a way to combine the two. And later on, that did prepare him to understand like the theories of the psychologist Carl Jung, that really helped him explore a lot of the imagery in his paintings. To the left, there's just like an image of some of like Schwankovsky's work, just like a piece of his still life paintings to show like the basics in drawing that he was able to pass on to Pollock in his earlier years. In 1930, Pollock moved to New York City with his brother, Charles Pollock, where they both studied at the Art Students League. The Art Students League is just like a league that was founded in the 1800s, 1875, by a group of artists. And Schwankovsky also attended the Art Students League as well. But while he was there, he did study under one of his most like major influencers slash like mentors, Thomas Hart Benton. Benton was a regionalist painter in the art movement of American realism. He focused a lot on paintings, murals, lithographs, and just realistic scenes of like small town America in the Midwest. But in his earlier years, like in the earlier 20th century, he was like a big influencer in like the abstract art expressionist movement. You could kind of see how his earlier work of the abstract art influenced a lot of the realist paintings that he created, because you can see how even though these are realist perceptions of the American Midwest, the curvature and the proportions in the human bodies are sort of like kind of extended or kind of just like dramatized. So it's kind of gives that sort of like surreal feeling to his drawings and paintings. And even in that, like it sort of gives like the same so it gives like sort of like a different sort of like emotional quality, rather than just having all of the paintings like painted like exactly how they are compared to like Schwankovsky's like still lifes. A lot of like the mystical and dark editions reflected some of the work of Albert Ryder, which is another artist that Jackson Pollock admired. So here's just like a just some visuals of Thomas Benton and Albert Ryder. You can see how they both focused a lot on realism, but both have like this surrealist quality as far as like the abstract like depiction of the mountains, or just like the proportions of the human body, and how that expresses like a different, it gives sort of like it gives a different like emotional aspect to the painting. Albert Ryder focuses a lot on dark elements where there's a lot of like light and dark contrast in nature, and even with just the curving of all the curving of the paintings and the curving of the people, it gives that same like extreme like emotional quality that you see a lot in you don't see a lot in, you do see a lot in abstract art, but it's not depicted as well in just plain realist art. So Benton does a good job at just kind of combining the two, and that had like a great impact on the way Jackson was able to evoke emotion in his future paintings. Just to talk a little bit about what was happening in the time period of 1940. During that arts movement, it was basically like a post World War II era where America was going to war against Germany, and the term abstract expressionism was first introduced because at that time the old styles of art and realism were being pushed and the boundaries were kind of being broken. So but it's being expanded a little bit, especially in music, art, like fashion. There was a period in time where it was a swing period where artists like Frank Sinatra or Louis Armstrong and Harry James were kind of introducing this old band jazz music sort of feel. So it kind of added to the way people's ideas of art or ideas of what's acceptable in the art world or fashion world or music world were were like acceptable or just like were being like applauded at the time. Here's like a painting by Seurat where like one of his techniques in expressing like realist subjects was pointillism, and those that's just an example of one of the more like unconventional methods and techniques that were being experimented with at the time, just like with fashion or just like in music. And obviously Pollock was a huge part of that time period and was greatly influenced by it. One of his main one of his main influencers was Janet Sobel. Janet, you can clearly see like she was definitely one of his she was definitely one of his influences as far as like his all over drip techniques, because he did go to an exhibition with Clement Greenberg, and he admitted that when he saw her exhibition, like her drawings, like it did have a huge impact on him, and he felt that he knew what he was missing from his work by viewing her work. You can see the similarities and the same techniques that he uses as far as the not only the drip techniques but just like combining images a lot and having sort of this crowded feel or like this sort of like explosive feel to the canvas. The same way she sort of like creates like this visual convergence of like all her feelings, like it's all expressed through physical actions, and that's always that's the similar methods that Pollock wanted to express when it came to using like gestural motions to express emotion on gestural actions to express emotion on the canvas. Another one of his major influence at the time was obviously Pablo Picasso. He was one of the most innovative painters of the 20th century. And what was interesting about like Picasso is that he's like most famously known for cubism and the way he depicts subjects. And Pollock was interested in him because of the way he had different perspectives in viewing the world, and he wanted to pretty much express this idea of seeing the world from several points of view, which Picasso really like depicts like really well. At the time, like modern art was obviously was breaking away from the conventional methods of viewing certain subjects, so this was like a way for him to distort what he was seeing and like sort of translate, like not only translate it naturally but translate it more through emotion and like a broader context. So even with his later drip paintings or his action paintings, he would often put the canvas on the floor and sort of like splatter paint from different parts of the canvas, because he says that it was a way for him to see the painting from different sides, and that's sort of like what he wanted to express in most of his work. The same way Picasso uses cubism to express sort of like the unknown or just things that aren't really depicted like literally, he uses like different like these aspects of the arms where they're just like the way he uses like different shapes to represent things that could be masculine or feminine, or even the shapes that could be animal faces. It's sort of like the unknown, or sort of like has like a certain mystery to it, or a sort of distorted way of viewing like people, animals, nature in general. This painting, The She Wolf, was one of Pollock's earlier works when before he was experimenting with the action painting and drip paintings, but you can sort of see the traces of how he first started, or the same like sort of free expression idea in this one. What's interesting is that he does explore like a lot of mythological themes. Like this particular painting, the title "The She Wolf" comes from the Roman mythology story of Remus and Romulus, where those brothers were actually twins, and they were the sons of the king of Rome at the time, and the king was afraid that he would get overthrown by his son, so he left them in a basket in the river, by the river. And then there's like always like this famous image of the twins getting suckled by a she wolf that came along to take care of them, and that was kind of like a symbol of the city of Rome, or like how ancient Rome came about. And you can see how he uses like that sort of like iconography with the she wolf to create like this unconscious image that isn't really depicted clearly, but you can sort of take certain aspects of it and kind of draw your own conclusions, like through the title or just like through what you can like grab from like the picture. He uses a lot of like broad brush strokes and just like these thick white lines, these thicker, like heavier marks to show a lot of shadows and darkness and like weird like calligraphy on the side. So it gives you sort of insight to what like the subject of the painting is. But he does give a quote that says, "She wolf came into existence because I had to paint it. Any attempt on my part to say something about it, to attempt explanation of the inexplicable, could only destroy it." So that was sort of interesting because same way like the Roman myth sort of gives like an insight to all these like ultimate, human mysteries. Like he wants to depict that same unconscious like feeling, or that same unconscious like depiction of the animal in a way that isn't literal, and he doesn't want to conceptualize any piece of the painting because it's just like his subconscious feelings like coming to life. Someone that was really important, I just felt like should be explained because she was a huge not even an influence, but a huge like force in Jackson Pollock's life, was Peggy Guggenheim. She, you can tell by her name that she was the niece of Solomon Guggenheim, who was the who the museum and the foundation was named after. Peggy was mostly known as an American art collector and just like a very wealthy socialite at the time. She actually commissioned Pollock to paint a mural for her Manhattan townhouse, and at the time, like she had like a lot of mixed feelings about his work. Like she wasn't really like blown by his process, or hadn't really seen anything that was sort of like capturing. But Marcel Duchamp and Howard Purcell were actually her assistants at the time, and they were really like pushing for him because they admired his like process and admired his work. So she kind of like put her trust in that idea, their opinions, I mean. So when she hired him, she was hiring him for a particular piece for her townhouse, and she basically wanted to see what his idea of what he could create from like his already like known abstract expressionist style, and see if he could produce something that was like worth her looking at for the time, her looking at for her house, I mean. So through all that, like Jackson came up with Mural. Mural was a piece that he made in 1943, and it was told that from Lee Krasner, his wife at the time, that he actually hadn't made this until the night before. Like Guggenheim became like really frustrated with like his process and what he was doing to get started, but she told him like, okay, you either make this tomorrow, you make it for this date, or you're not gonna get paid for anything. So obviously he was like, besides being under a lot of pressure, like this is something that he really like needed to produce to be like his first like introduction into the contemporary art world. So he created Mural, and you can even see the Picasso influence in the way he uses like these energetic brush strokes of like teal, yellow, purple, reds, and whites. And this was like a really big breakthrough for his personal style because After a while, he came up with the quote that says, "A stampede of every animal in the American West, cows and horses, antelopes and buffaloes, everything is charging across the goddamn surface." So in that statement, although you can't really pick out and conceptualize like, okay, this is a horse, this is a cow, you could see how Thomas Hart Benton had that sort of regionalist painter influence in what he wanted to depict as subjects. He sort of like combined like those methods of surrealism and that same unconscious imagery of like these like cows and horses, and just wanted to put them in a combine them in a setting that was more subconscious and just like evoked more emotion and just a lot of like motion through his like finer brush strokes, or just like the dripping again. He has like that introduction into his like technique right there, and just like releasing that sort of like, again, that unconscious imagery. He When Guggenheim, this was again the piece that he made for Guggenheim, and she states, "I took one look at it and I knew Jackson was the greatest painter this country had ever produced." Lavender Mist in 1947 was pretty much his his one of his like first like pieces involving like the dripping and the action painting, basically the drip paintings, with the splattering and the squirting of the paint on, like, again, the mural size canvases on his studio floor. So he wanted to sort of emphasize this same idea of gestural abstraction and releasing this sort of like emotion that was across the canvas by putting it on the floor. It was more of like, again, seeing the painting from all different points of view, and focus more on what he could do to reflect what was going on in his inner mind. It was said that he didn't really love it when people would would comment on his work and say it was chaos, because, like, again, like there was like this sort of like order in his chaos. It was sort of like he was doing like these motions to evoke a sort doing these motions to evoke a certain feeling, and that was really intentional. It wasn't just like a mess placed on the floor just for no reason. And that was where his the idea of sort of like veiling the image was really important to him, because once he veiled the image, like it didn't really like visually show everything that was going on. It was sort of like him covering up, like intentionally covering up what he wanted you to see, because it didn't have like the way mural has at least a bit of like curves, and it has like a bit of like a little bit more shape to it, and just like you can actually see what's going on. He wanted to veil what was the veil like the imagery in the painting, so that it could express more of that free association of the unconscious mind, and just show the viewer, like, like the parts of his own unconscious, and that sort of reflected in a sort of like a more of like a linear pattern sort of thing, where he was fusing like basically like image and form and make it into one. And that like inspired a lot of his further like poured and drip paintings. So something that was really important was like the symbolism in his work, and the start of the Jungian therapy. Like, Pollock was already known for his unconventional use of tools, where like he's a type of artist to like get rid of all his what do you call it, paint brushes, and use sort of like household paints, or like alkyd enamels, things that were just like even sticks, like things he could find around the house, because he says that it created like a natural growth out of need. And at the time, like, he was already overcoming like alcoholism and bipolar disorder, so like the Jungian theories were sort of a way for him to like overcome those like mental difficulties, and sort of produce like a physical form of art that he could like see and feel, and like express his emotions in a different way. I think it's important to just kind of break down a part of like what the Jungian theories actually were, and because it says a lot. I'm using words like subconscious and unconscious a lot, so it's like important to like understand what those words meant, especially for like creative minds, or even in like psychotherapy in general. So Carl Jung basically believed in two kinds of worlds. So you have the outer world and you have the inner world. So the outer world is basically like the conscious like outward experiences of humans and how they interact in the physical world. Like, your persona is the way you identify, like how you present yourself to people, sort of like the mask you put on whenever you're like the way you like go to work or you go to your job or you just like you go to school. The way like it presents itself like in the ego form where like it's mostly related to like your thoughts, your actions, your emotions, and like everything that has to do with your identity and how you move in the conscious world, right? So then you have that in the outer world, and then you have in the inner world. The inner world is basically like your shadow self or the ideas of animus or anima. And your shadow self is basically the unconscious parts of your being. And when it comes to the animus and the anima is like similar to the yin and yang qualities in a person, where like you find each other in the you find each other in the other. So animus is the are the masculine qualities that you find in women that are the unconscious masculine qualities in women, and the anima is the feminine unconscious quality that you find in a man. So the idea is that Jungian like was intending for these people to have a balance between the two, because when you have a balance between the two, you have like your true sense of self. And when you realize that, or at least you're aware of that, you can maneuver in the world a different kind of way, and you can maneuver with your identity expressing your true self versus like these masks in your ego, or just functioning only through your conscious mind. There are parts of your unconscious mind that have to come together so that you can produce like physical works of art, or just like even move in the world a different way as your true self versus like their shadow self or just your ego self. So in understanding that, these theories were introduced by Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, but the person that Pollock actually went to for psychology was Joseph Henderson. And at the time, like it was kind of encouraged that a lot of surrealist or abstract expressionist painters used the Jungian theories, because it was all about like shaping the idea of like their creative capacity of their unconscious and conscious mind. So the theory was basically to having like these painters like use the imagery from their own dreams and experiment with them by doing like different mark making techniques and just like expressing what was in their head in like a safer, healthier way for them. And it was like this action of like freeing the artist from like the conscious control of their creativity. So you were sort of enabling that, or activating like that unconscious sense of yourself, so that when you were conscious of it, it was like manifesting into this physical art form that was like, out of the ordinary, or just like, a true expression of your true self. So in 1939 and 40, like Pollock was working with Joseph Henderson to overcome his like alcoholism and his like what do you call it, and bipolar disorder at the time. He submitted over 83 drawings to get analyzed by Joseph Henderson, and these are just one of the 83 that he presented to him. And you can sort of see in the left here how he sort of combined like the same Picasso techniques of cubism, where there's like this really, I want to say, like dynamic energy in like multiple line forms. And it's like when you look at it initially, like one person to the naked eye could say, oh, this kind of looks like a bird cage or ribs or some kind of like skeletal structure, or even the way he uses these like shades of red, yellows, and oranges and browns. It kind of reminds you of like fire, or even like these, like this kind of looks like an arm, just like conceptualizing different pieces of it. And you can see how he combines like animals. You have like in the next part, you see this kind of looks like horses, and like almost combining it into a man, and just like these several the same curvature that we see in the surrealist paintings from Albert Ryder, or even like the influence in from Thomas Hart Benton. You see how he combines like these theories that Jungian was practicing when it came to like anima and animus, just like having these qualities, finding these qualities in each other. So you could see how like the Jungian iconography was used for him to help him like adapt to release what was going on in his subconscious mind or in his dreams. And like these same themes of like life forces are still being presented, where you see like animals, like life and death, like birth, power, and even failure, like manifesting in these drawings. So yeah, that's something that kind of just made his like paintings a little bit more extraordinary, because even though he was struggling with mood swings, like the during his treatment, like the symbolism in these paintings, like they became like more and more obscured, and he began to just like produce like really expressive like compositions of his work, and like that was eventually his breakthrough. His wife Lee Krasner actually said that in the summer of 1939, or was actually reported by his wife Lee Krasner and Clement Greenberg, that he was like anxious. He wasn't anxious anymore. Like he was sustaining from drinking, and like he was working with these images to express like what was going on with him at the time. And like a lot, like one big thing that was always just really important to him was that he wanted to create like this sense of intimacy between like the artist and the canvas. So when he was able to access that subconscious feeling, like this was him making those subconscious feelings into a real thing. um it was kind of noticeable that like his he did have like a little bit of like Native American and Mexican influence in his art. It was said that one of his influencers, David Albert Siqueiros, in 1936, he went to a seminar at the MoMA where Siqueiros was showing his work, and Siqueiros is he's a muralist, and a lot of his work was really politically themed. He's like an anti-fascist, like communist sort of painter, and he was also one of those painters like Pollock who use unconventional methods and who use like unconventional tools to display his art. Instead of doing like what is it like how do you say like quick drying cement. Oh, instead of using like pigmented and plastered fresco, he would use like quick drying cement or just like drill guns, like certain just like really like weird tools. The same way like Pollock wanted to like show like what like his expression in a different way from like the traditional uses and traditional tools. Um, yeah, so he while he was at the seminar, that was like the first location that Pollock experimented with like the use of enamel and enamel and enamel and just like the pouring drip paint at the time on canvas to get sort of that really impulsive effect for his art. And although he never actually admitted it, there was like a similar imitation in Native American Indian art where in the 1940s like his techniques like did change dramatically after he visited a he viewed like a Native American Indian sand painting demonstration at the MoMA. And like the thing about the Native American sand painting is that the Indian medicine men would sometimes like spread colorful sand like across surfaces and like a really like a seemingly like like nonsensical way, just like a random sort of like dripping sort of method, but it was with sand and it was more organized, and it kind of had like this certain like intentional feeling towards it. So that was definitely like an influence when it came to like um Pollock's like drip painting techniques. And the thing is that like a lot of Native American art has like this. They often have like these common themes when it came to subject matter about like life, birth, life cycles, like death, nature, and animals, and that's something that was definitely transferred in a lot of themes in Pollock's work. He has this one painting called Guardians of the Secret that he made in 1943, and it was interesting because when you do look at like the individual concepts in the art, these look like almost like two pillars, and you can sort of like see the inner forms of the art like sort of make out like this sort of, you see like the Roman mythology or even like the same iconography of like the she wolf on the bottom here, and it's like it almost looks as if like those two poles are like protecting what's inside of the what's like in the inner painting. And Indian paintings were often seen as sacred or guarded, so that was sort of like an interesting like attempt to show like how protecting like these like human mysteries again once again are seen throughout his art. And another interesting part is that the Indian medicine men often use like the though that same like sand pouring is like a healing effect, like it was like a healing sort of like a abstract healing influence for the people that were doing it and for the people that viewed it. And Pollock also made a comment that like that doing like this work was sort of like the same sort of shamanistic attempt of like to healing himself like while he was doing it. So even in the Guardians of the Secret, you still see the same themes of just like abstract expressions of male and female, the same way you have the Jungian theory of like man and woman, like male and female, like once again. And like yeah, you can definitely see how those same themes, or even just like the act of doing art, and like the same like healing qualities are just present in both like the Indian Mexican influences in his art and like his own paintings. Just introducing just Lee Krasner and her legacy and what she did after his death. Lee Krasner was his wife, and she was actually also an abstract expressionist painter, but a lot of her work got overshadowed by the work of Pollock because she did spend a lot of time just kind of like building his career, sense like building his reputation as far as like introducing him to the contemporary art world. Like she did have like really like a lot of extensive knowledge when it came to the contemporary art world, and just like her influence when it came to like having like certain works being presented in the MoMA, or just like even just like building his legacy after he died, and after his car crash. Like she did like plan a lot of his lead shows after that. And while they started their relationship in 1942, they, again, like I mentioned, like they weren't rich. Like they didn't start off rich at all. Like that's when Peggy Guggenheim kind of came along, and she was sort of like helping them out a lot, especially like after they got married. They didn't really grow up wealthy or anything like that, so they kind of did that struggle together. So during that time, she didn't really focus a lot on her own art, and she was sort of pushing more of his publicizing more of his contemporary art styles. But even in her works, you can sort of see how they maybe may have like influenced each other in their pieces, because you can see how she has the same sort of expressionist, like crowded art techniques. Like she studied under Hans Hofmann, who focus more on bold colors and shapes and just more distinct like objects, while Thomas Hart Benton and Albert Ryder, sort of people that Pollock looked at as far as like their realist techniques and their surrealist techniques. Even with Picasso, it was more like shapes and just certain like different tones, but they definitely had a similar qualities in their work. Um, yeah, so she Pollock was actually the one who wanted her to experiment more with like expressing, like stop using like still lifes, and stop using like human qualities, and try to get her to like paint more from her emotion, and just try to get her to release like certain feelings. So that may have had like a huge influence on her later pieces. Yeah. And just like my opinion on the work of Pollock, like I do appreciate like a lot of his earlier works, like the She Wolf, and even some of his. I'm not like a big fan of his splattered and drip paintings, but I appreciate like where it's coming from, in a sense of like him using it. Any piece of art that's just like a manifestation of what you're feeling, or just like any healing practice. Like I can't really look at something and say like, oh, like this is just like nonsense, or just like I don't see like where this is coming from, because I feel like that's like the basis of like a lot of art. The basis of a lot of art is just like people trying to release their subconscious, or just like release like, or have a balance even between like their subconscious and their conscious mind, so that they can produce something that like evokes emotion, at least like the viewer, or evokes motion for them. So I appreciate like that aspect of his work, and like what he was trying to accomplish in that, and it honestly got him pretty far. I do love the way I do love like the mention of like Jungian practices, and like especially like his drawing, because I like the way he sort of like combined the animals, and just like the anima slash animus like topic was really interesting in that, like him just like combining different like life forms. Like though I think his drawings would definitely have to be like my favorite aspect of like Pollock's work, because it wasn't even like shown that often when it comes to like when people talk about Jackson Pollock. But he did get a lot of like, those are really detailed, and I like the way those were presented, or like those were explained at least. Um, and yeah, that's sort of like the end of my presentation about Jackson Pollock. Thank you.